is twice the alumni here at University of Hawaii at Manoa. She got her NREM MEM degree in 2020, and just this year she got her JD degree here at the William S. Richardson School of Law. She is and she also got certificates in Native Hawaiian law and environmental law. So Casco is currently a judicial law clerk for Honorable Chief Judge Lisa Ambinoza at the Intermediate Court of Appeals. And born and raised in Maui, she is a Kanaka Maoli scholar who seeks opportunities to engage in projects that center Indigenous knowledges, voices, and issues. Hi'ile hopes to contribute to the legacy of Indigenous changemakers whose impact has shifted paradigms, as well as Hawaii's complex relationship with the legal system. And then I'd just like to say that no matter where I went on campus to promote her presentation today, NREM, the law school, Hawaiian studies, everybody really had high regard for her. So please join me in welcoming Hi'ile Casco.
Aloha kākou. Aloha. Mahalo Liz for that kind introduction, and mahalo to all of you for joining me today. Although it wasn't too long ago, being back in this classroom specifically brings back memories of when I was a master's student. And I think it feels longer than it actually was because my last semester is actually when COVID hit and we went fully online. So I haven't seen, many of the mentors who are present in this room for a really long time. And so mahalo especially to Professor Litton and Professor Price for the opportunity to come back and reconnect with you folks. I feel really grateful for that. And, I'm hoping for our talk today to be really informal and, just a safe space to ask questions and talk to a recent law school graduate and admitted attorney who is still in the process of really figuring out what path they want to take in both their personal and professional life. So, in that regard, please feel free to interrupt me at any time. Folks on Zoom can drop questions in the chat and Professor Price can help me monitor those. And we'll also have some time at the end for Q&A, and that can, obviously include questions that might not have been raised or prompted by this presentation in particular. And really importantly, before I begin, I do need to provide a disclaimer that as an employee of the Hawaii State Judiciary, the information and opinions shared in this presentation and the Q&A are my own, and they don't reflect that of the Hawaii Intermediate Court of Appeals or my boss, Chief Judge Lisa Ambinoza. As a law clerk in the appellate courts, I'm bound by the Hawaii Code of Judicial Conduct, which requires that I uphold certain duties to the courts and to my judge. And also, as an attorney now, I'm also bound by the Hawaii Rules of Professional Conduct. So in that respect, I will have to field questions and respectfully decline any that I'm really not comfortable answering given my duties under these rules. And as a baby attorney, this practice has been really new and a learning experience for me, even in just talking with my friends and family, having to have that filter and, uphold my duties to the courts. So, I will be honest that I'm still navigating that, which has been a really valuable experience on its own. And similarly, lastly, along those lines, I want to share that I have amended my presentation a bit. As you folks might have noticed by the flyer, I originally intended to talk about the developing field of critical and contextual inquiry and also restorative justice. But in thinking more about how to best share those topics in ways that I feel are informative and helpful to you folks, just given my role to the courts, I don't feel like I'm really currently in the best position to discuss those in particular at this forum at this time. So to the extent that some of you were specifically interested in those topics, I really sincerely apologize, but also at the same time encourage you to meet with me after this presentation because I have a ton of really excellent resources to share, including academic articles written by my own professors and colleagues that I think would be helpful and really interesting to you folks regarding those topics. So just as a quick overview roadmap, I'll spend a good amount of time sharing about myself and my academic and professional journey in hopes that it's helpful, especially to the students in this class, in exposing you to potentially different career pathways and opportunities you might not have considered before. And then after that, I'll discuss and review some key legal provisions for environmental and Native Hawaiian rights law that I personally engage with during law school and also in my professional experiences, such as in my classes, my clinical work, externships, and also in my scholarship. And my intention for overviewing these is really simply to give you folks a snapshot of what is a broad and evolving field of environmental and Native Hawaiian rights law, which, as you can imagine, often overlap, in case that it's helpful for helping you folks kind of frame your current or future work, and especially as it relates to policy. And then finally, I'll close with some nuggets of advice that I've learned and lived by throughout my academic journey, and then, open for Q&A so we can kind of talk story and learn from each other. So to begin, as a Kanaka Maoli, to know me is to really know my ʻāina. And so naturally, I want to share where I'm from and, where my kupuna are from as a starting point to understanding who I am as a person. So I come from the areas of Waiʻehu, Lahaina, and Kaupo, Maui. Waiʻehu is located in central Maui and also part of Nawaiʻeha, which is known as the Great Four Waters of Maui. Lahaina, as I'm sure you folks are familiar with, given the recent fires and its coverage on the news, is in Maui Komohana, or West Maui. And then Kaupo, which is the ʻāina that's pictured here on the screen, is a rural and historic ranching community located on the east side of Maui. And, I really grew up in all of these places, which I really feel is characteristic of Maui kids in general, who just like gallivant and venture the whole island and have relationships and family everywhere. But in particular, as it relates to, my academic and professional journey, I feel like I'm really of Kaupo in particular, where I watch my kupuna, these are my grandparents here on the bottom left, steward our family homestead through what I've come to know is known as agroforestry. And it's really, this early connection to place and growing up in this space on weekends and, any kind of school break that I had, that set the rest of my academic path in motion. My family's generational homestead in Kaupo is a kuleana that I'm working towards and working to return to actually as a lineal descendant and, next generation steward of this ʻāina. After I graduated from Kamehameha schools in 2014, I ventured to upstate New York to study environmental science and indigenous studies at Cornell University. I actually had originally started in agricultural science, but I transferred into the environmental program after completing my first year. And while this was arguably a big move for an island girl, many of my close friends and professors were from the indigenous community there, namely the Haudenosaunee, and they also are known as the Iroquois. And really engaging with that community and being part of that community helped me to explore my Native identity. It's something I never really questioned before. It's something that I've never had to reflect on until moving outside of home. And question how that really influenced my perspective and my approach and the ways I engage with the environmental field. And so, doing so really gave me what I believe are intellectual tools to critique what I was learning, which was traditional Western environmental science, and also exposed me to familiar paradigms of traditional ecological knowledge, place and community-based natural resource management, and also larger themes of decolonization and what that meant for me personally as a Kanaka and also for my island home. And so, this learning and I think more importantly, unlearning time of my life positioned me towards indigenous resource management and policy. And really, if I learned anything from my time at Cornell, it was to really utilize the resources that universities have to offer in terms of opportunities, funding, and access to knowledge and information. And that includes professional relationships with professors, researchers, and graduate students. I really believe I used my time at Cornell to explore and dabble in new interests because that's what I feel like college is for. And that led me into what might really now seem like random research gigs. So for example, I worked at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, which focuses on the study and education of really all things birds in North America and also internationally. I also worked as a community-based deer management case study assistant, which I feel like is even more and more relevant now, given our invasive ungulate issue, issue and problem on Molokai, also on Maui now, and really across all the islands. And in that role, I helped to develop I have really no clue actually the evolution of that project, but at the time it was an interactive online decision support tool for communities and decision makers across North America specifically to help them address their deer issues, given the context that they were in, whether it was like a small rural community or if they had access to larger resources, whether sharpshooting was appropriate or, other types of management issues might have been more suitable for whatever context they were in. And then towards the end of my time at Cornell, I had the opportunity to do some research at the USGS Pacific Islands Climate Adaptation Center under a treasured mentor of mine, Christian Giardina, who many of you likely know, and who gave me the opportunity to do funded research to conduct interviews with local farmers, Hawaiian cultural practitioners, historians, and other leaders from Maui to learn about how traditional and local knowledges can be used to provide insights and address issues like climate change, variability, and drought in Hawaii. And so it was really this experience in particular that inspired my interest in returning home after undergrad to really explore community and place-based natural resource management, and especially as it implicates Native Hawaiians and other Indigenous people. And so after I graduated from Cornell in 2018, I came back to pursue a master's in environmental management in this very department as a way to really give myself time to digest this work and explore what it looked like on the ground in my community. My master's project, which Professor Kim Carlson, who's actually now at New York University, and Professor Creighton, who some of you might have classes under, helped me develop. It was entitled Kui Kapono, Developing Environmental Advocacy Strategies for Community-Based Natural Resource Stewards and Organizations in Hawaii. And what my master's project really focused on was supporting small community groups to effectively participate in climate change policy and decision-making processes, both at local and state levels. So, county level as well as state levels. And in pursuing this work, I collaborated with many natural resource stewards in Hawaii to really just gain insights about how to support and increase their participation in legislative processes, especially as it relates to climate advocacy, policy development, and decision-making processes. So as part of that, as you folks are probably aware in your own master's programs, I conducted interviews, I did a lot of literature review, I pursued participatory research, and as a result, I identified really key strategies, different types of tools and types of information needed to eventually, plan for effective civic engagement. And my final product for that was a sort of workbook / toolkit that compiled all that information, knowledge, resources, and tools into one final product. And so, at bottom, my final project was intended to empower community members, because I feel like even now as an attorney, like I'm still learning about how to effectively engage with decision makers, whether that be judges or legislators or even just agency officials. And so my whole kind of like purpose and intention behind my project was to increase confidence and therefore participation in decision-making processes. And along those lines, I really want to send a shout out and special mahalo to the Ha'oli Maloa Foundation for making that NREM degree and this project in particular possible. My return home and the work I pursued under NREM wouldn't really be possible without their support and the resources they provided to me. So to the extent that any of you are Ha'oli Maloa scholars, I'd love to talk story and chat just about how you folks are doing in the program, being an alumni and beneficiary of that program myself. And then I think as the final point here, while I was in my master's program, I took a Hawaii water law class from Professor Kua Sprode, who introduced me to the legal field and also showed me the important work of bridging what was my science background in my bachelor's and now in my master's, the natural resource background that I had with the tools and opportunities of the law and the legal system. And her class really culminated much of where I was already headed in terms of wanting to be part of a larger effort in enacting change on a broader, more systemic level. So yeah, under the guidance of my mentors and especially Professor Sprode, I made my way to the William S. Richardson School of Law. And when I started in 2020, again, like transitioning is still in COVID, we were still in the midst of the pandemic. So I did my first year completely online. And as you can imagine, that was really challenging. I didn't get to like meet my classmates as much or like talk story, for my study groups was a much more challenging when you're not like talking in between breaks and, you have to like reach out on your own, which is, I did that, but it was scary. You don't know what lawyers are like until you're around lawyers, which is a good thing. But yeah, especially entering a new field that required me to think and write much differently than I was in the science field. But I'm excited to share that I graduated this past May with certificates in Native Hawaiian law and environmental law. And while at Richardson, again, I just like really dabbled in every possible thing that I was interested in. I worked as a legal research assistant at the Kuliao Center for Excellence in Native Hawaiian Law. And I also interned with awesome organizations like Earth Justice, Sierra Club of Hawaii, and Conservation International. So if any of you folks are interested in those organizations, we can touch base and I can share more about my experiences there. There's so many projects that I've worked on, so I'm sure we can find some like common ground and underlying mutual interests. And really importantly, I also took several clinical classes, which are unique in that they afford students the opportunity to work on live issues with real clients as law students. So for example, the Native Hawaiian Rights Clinic is a live client non-litigation course that second and third year students can take to start to really practice and implement their lawyering skills, doing things like analyzing live legal issues, developing and implementing a case strategy, collaborating with your clients and other experts about how to approach a certain legal issue, as well as even just conducting factual and legal research, which oftentimes led us into like the Hawaii State Archives and, different academic articles I might not have read before. And, this course is particularly designed to serve Kanaka Maoli in particular, and also, especially neighbor island communities. So people in Maui, people in Hawaii, Big Island. And so I feel like the Native Hawaiian Rights Clinic is really beneficial in that you have the opportunity to potentially go on in-person site visits and meet with your clients in person, one-on-one, understand their ʻāina, understand who they are, and therefore, have a better clearer and stronger connection about the issues that they might be facing. And, specifically when I was in clinic, we were working on water permitting for Maui Komohana, which I think is, especially relevant and important now given the Lahaina fires. And then finally, on this point, my recent scholarship focuses on themes of restorative environmental justice, social justice. I've dabbled a little bit in Indigenous intellectual property, as well as, these kind of foundational themes for me, which are community-based resource management and other types of interdisciplinary work that bridges science, law, and policy. And I have an article currently now in the works that I can't discuss too much about currently, but it explores these themes in relation to each other. And I really look forward to sharing that when the time comes. And, to the extent that any of you folks are interested in law school, there's so much to unpack there, given that it's, my most recent program. So if you have questions about that, I'm happy to dive deeper in Q&A and even after this presentation. And so after I graduated this past May, I spent the summer studying for the Hawaii Bar, as law graduates do. Happy to say I passed and was recently sworn into the Hawaii State Bar, as well as the U.S. District Court of Hawaii Federal Bar. And since September, I've been working as a law clerk for Chief Judge Lisa M. Pinoza of the Hawaii Intermediate Court of Appeals. High praises, she's amazing. Just watch her journey and you'll be pleased. And I'm excited to share, I shared with some of you folks before this, that she was recently confirmed by the Hawaii Senate as a new Associate Justice of the Hawaii Supreme Court yesterday. So I will actually accompany her as she transitions into her new role as a Hawaii Supreme Court Justice in the near future. And, as you can imagine, I can't really get into the specifics of the type of cases I'm working on at the courts, but generally, I'd like to share what my job entails, and this is like the best way I could think of like conceptualizing everything. It essentially entails reading the briefs from the respective parties, which is essentially, a brief is essentially kind of like an essay of their grievances and their arguments, legal arguments. Reading the decision of the lower court and how and why they ruled the way they did, the type of law they applied, the reasoning that they had for coming to the outcome that they did. Researching and applying the relevant law, which can include, constitutional provisions, statutes, and other types of case law, which is essentially judge-made law. They're like the opinions from other cases that were decided on previously. And then, finally drafting the final judgment or disposition, which resolves the parties' legal issues. And, we work very, very closely with our judge to do this work and in this process. And I think that's where the real value of a clerkship lies, because, you get to learn from and see how judges make decisions and approach a particular case or a particular issue firsthand. And you can kind of, as a clerk, you kind of have those like behind the scenes insights that really go into addressing these issues that we get. And then, finally, after my clerkship, I plan to return home to Maui to continue stewarding my family homestead in Kaupo, and also, be a legal and environmental advocate for my community in whatever way that might look like when the time comes. And so, with that, I like to transition now into sharing some of those key legal provisions that I heavily engaged with while I was in law school, working on my Native Hawaiian law and environmental law certificates. And especially as it relates to your folks' work in NREM, I think having an awareness of these laws can be really helpful in guiding your policy and scientific research in efforts to improve the environmental health of our state and even nationally and globally. So to start, for those of you who don't engage with the law often, I would like to introduce this statute because of its uniqueness to Hawaii in particular. It's Hawaii Revised Statute Section 5-75, which is the law defining the aloha spirit. And yes, it's a real law. It's like actually a statute that we have in our state. It reads, aloha spirit is the coordination of mind and heart within each person. It brings each person to the self. Each person must think and emote good feelings to others. It also defines the principle, and the statute also defines the principles that make up aloha, which can include values of akahi, which is kindness, lokahi, unity, and ha'aha'a, humility. The statute continues on to describe aloha in practice and also acknowledges its roots in Hawaiian culture and philosophy. It says, aloha is more than a word of greeting or farewell or a salutation. Aloha means mutual regard and affection and extends warmth and caring with no obligation in return. Aloha is the essence of relationships in which each person is important to every other person for collective existence. I just think this is like so beautiful. Like rarely do you see like legal language that is just so poetic and beautiful and encapsulating of our values that are unique to our state. And so, yeah, I just wanted to share that with you folks for your awareness. I only recently learned about this statute when I had started my clerkship. So, yeah. And lastly, what I think is especially important about this statute is that, like other laws, it holds weight. Part B of this provision states that in exercising their power on behalf of the people and in fulfillment of their responsibilities, obligations, and service to the people, our state decision makers, including the legislature, governor, and the courts, may contemplate and give consideration to the aloha spirit. And I'll be honest, I'm not too sure what that looks like in practice, and I don't have any, specific examples to share, but I think fundamentally, it's really, really valuable to have this value and what is really a guiding principle that is so fundamental and unique to the fabric of Hawaii articulated and codified in our laws. I think that in itself has a lot of value. And similarly, our state's attitudes towards the environment are also memorialized through our state constitution. This provision is especially relevant to the work that you folks do in NREM. it reads, each person has the right to a clean and healthful environment as defined by laws relating to environmental quality, including control of pollution and conservation, protection and enhancement of natural resources. And importantly, it also reads that any person may enforce this right against any party, public or private, through appropriate legal proceedings subject to reasonable limitations and regulation provided by law. And I think really key to note here is that not all states have these types of constitutional environmental rights protections. So I think we're really fortunate to be afforded this protection, and to the extent that we can try to understand what this means, especially under a climate change future. Another key constitutional provision is Article 12, Section 7, which reaffirms and protects traditional and customary Native Hawaiian rights and practices. I really worked heavily with this provision in the classes I took pursuing my Native Hawaiian rights certificate, since it undergirds really much of the statutes and case law that have been developed in regard to the rights of Native Hawaiian people. For example, this provision is so foundational to the case law developed in Kapa'akaio ʻāina versus Land Use Commission, which is a Hawaii Supreme Court decision that was issued in 2000. And in that case, the Hawaii Supreme Court, what I think is like the value of this case is that they introduced an analytical framework that governmental agencies must specifically consider when balancing their obligations to protect traditional and customary Native Hawaiian rights and practices against private property, as well as competing public interests. And in that case, the Hawaii Supreme Court expressly acknowledged a variety of traditional and customary rights that were asserted by the plaintiffs, which is the party that brought the lawsuit, including, the gathering of sea salt, opihi, limu, kupe'e, ha'ukeuke, and the court also recognized the religious significance of the lava flow that occurred in the ahupua'a of Ka'upulehu back in the 1800s, 1801. And so in agreeing that the proposed project in that case would infringe on the traditional and customary rights of Native Hawaiians of that area, the court had noted that Article 12, Section 7 of the Hawaii Constitution obligates agencies to protect the reasonable exercise of customarily and traditionally exercised rights of Native Hawaiians to the extent feasible. And so listed here on the screen is the three-part framework developed by the court, which mandates agencies who, one, identify the scope of valued cultural, historical, and natural resources in the area, including to the extent to which traditional and customary Native Hawaiian rights are exercised, like currently in the petition area. Secondly, to the extent that those resources, which include, again, traditional and customary Native Hawaiian rights, will be affected or impaired by the proposed action. And then lastly, address or understand the feasible action, if any, to be taken to reasonably protect those rights and practices if they are found to exist. And so, really importantly, this framework seeks to operationalize or effectuate the state's obligation to protect Native Hawaiian customary and traditional practices, while also, balancing and reasonably accommodating competing private and public interests. And so I really share this because this is one way that our constitutional provisions, Article 12, Section 7, gets operationalized in more local decision-making processes that happen, as in this case, at the agency level. And so, with that, I've covered 3 different types or areas of law that I have and I still engage with. The first being statutes, which are enacted by the legislature, constitutional law, and then also case law, as you can see here, which is the type of law that's made through judicial decisions by the courts. And again, at bottom, I hope this is just helpful to you folks in giving you context about what are really the laws and policies that likely guide your work and research here. And then finally, I just wanted to close by sharing some lessons that I've learned and lived by throughout my professional journey thus far. There are many, but here are kind of a few that came to mind as I was developing this presentation for today. First, as a Native Hawaiian woman in the science and legal fields, I've often had to deal with imposter syndrome. And those are feelings that, these academic and professional spaces are not meant for me, that I don't belong in them, and that I'm not worthy or good enough to be a part of them. And while these feelings are valid and stem from what are historic and systemic inequalities, I think it's important to know, especially as students, that you're, at bottom, not alone, and that there are mentors who are wanting to help you process those experiences and have maybe personally shared them themselves. And so, what I've learned is that once you start doing really hard things, and once you start challenging yourself outside of your comfort zone, it's really key and important to have a solid and supportive community to uplift you, but also help you get back to yourself. And another gem of knowledge is from my mom, who has personally seen me, learn and grow throughout this journey. I'd often find myself contemplating whether or not to, apply for a certain position or a certain scholarship. And again, just like feeling the weight of imposter syndrome and going through that mental headspace of wanting to deny myself opportunities before even applying, just, out of fear for failure, or again, just not feeling like I'm worthy enough. And when in those situations, she always reaffirmed to me what I've come to understand is really an olelo no eau of let them tell you no. And in other words, that it just means like, don't cut yourself short and reject yourself an opportunity. Like you can let others do that, but don't do that for yourself. Be courageous and brave enough to go for it, because you never know what might happen. And it's really hard because you can understand that logically and theoretically, but in practice that can be really difficult. And so, let them tell you no is essentially the mentality of betting on yourself and backing yourself, and also feeling satisfied that if you do that, then you've done enough and you've done everything that you can. And then finally, to remember your why, why you decided to pursue a graduate degree, why you applied and accepted entry into this specific NREM program, and why you do the work that you do. And sometimes, it's easy to forget like where our passion has stemmed from, our inspiration and our purpose in the midst of our everyday lives, because, much of that can be repetitive, mundane, and unexciting. But I really encourage you folks to the degree that you don't do this already, which is to develop a daily practice of reflection and contemplation regarding whether or not the decisions that you're making every day are in alignment with your goals and aspirations. That's something I do constantly. And to the extent that they might not align, kind of evaluate that and consider that might not necessarily be a bad thing in the larger context of growth and learning and change. So yeah, I just kind of wanted to leave you folks with those nuggets. And so, with that, I'd like to mahalo you folks again for joining me here today, allowing me to share about myself and my work, and also open the floor to any questions you might have so that we can talk story.
Yes. I was wondering if you could speak to like the duration of your cases that you are involved in or that you're knowledgeable in, from anything like Nawai Eha, which took decades to,
Yeah, it really varies. It really varies. I recently worked on a case that dates back to 2016. So that's like an ancient case that we're trying to push through and get resolved because, during our legal, judicial process, the parties are waiting for an answer, right? They're waiting for a remedy, they're waiting for a resolution so they themselves can move on with their lives. But I've got cases that were just, initiated in the past year, like in 2022. And you have to remember, I'm also at the appellate court. So that means that a case has already made its way through the trial courts. The parties have presented their evidence. It's been decided on by a judge, and then it makes its way on to the appellate courts. And we kind of, we take another look at the issue and the facts and the circumstances of the parties and make a decision that way. So it can really vary. The 2016 one is that old, I won't do the math. And then, the ones that were decided upon last year are only a year old or so. So, and it varies, right? With like how much time a given issue requires, right? Some issues are more complex than others. some issues have never been decided before. So to that extent, we're creating new precedent, which requires us to think even, I think, more deeply about where we want the direction of the law to go, and us kind of setting that forth as an issue of first impression, right? So yeah, it really varies. I can't really give a timeline. Thanks for asking. Is anyone here interested? Oh, go ahead.
I want to just say that I'm so happy that your mother told you, let them tell you no,
Mhm.
and that you went for it and you let go of that imposter syndrome.
Yeah,
And that you went for Lisa to be her law clerk, and now you're going to the Supreme Court.
Right.
So don't ever think, that, okay? And then I can see you, it's like a nice continuity,
Mm,
okay, from going, so.
thank you. Mahalo
I'm
for
proud
that.
of you for doing it.
Oh, I really appreciate that. Yeah, it's been a journey for sure.
And lucky you're going to Supreme Court. Look
Yeah,
how fast.
The timing was
So
just
fast.
perfect. I was gonna ask if anyone in here is interested in law school at all, or just has any type of interest in the law, a little bit, yeah. What is the hesitation, I guess?
I think just. I'm 33 and I wanna, start working.
Yeah.
With what I'm interested in, what I'm passionate about, but it's not off the table.
Okay,
Especially since I am taking that emerging water issues in Hawaii too, and I feel like it's opened a whole another
Oh,
door
yeah.
for me.
that's what happened to me, so I wouldn't be surprised if you apply, yeah. And like similarly along the same lines, right? Like you can always apply and then figure it out at that point. I think that's like a shift in my mentality that I've had since like undergrad, is just like, why not apply? And then you can like decide whether or not that's for you. But to the extent that the interest is there and that there's like some type of spark in that type of knowledge, I think, besides financially having to pay for fees of the application, I think there's no really drawbacks to just going for it and trying. Yeah. You as well, what kind of law are you interested in, or where did that come from?
Yeah, I'm not sure what specific kind of law, but I guess like environmental justice, wine rights law as well.
Awesome.
Yeah, one thing kind of making me a little bit hesitant, I'm an undergrad right now, graduating this spring, but I see that the law can be really strong on paper and kind of fail to translate into real results for communities and to justice on the ground. So I'm a little hesitant to spend so much time and energy investing in something that even when correctly applied might not accomplish real results in the same way that organizing or some other form of action might. So yeah, I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a really good observation. Yeah, I think it'd be really difficult, right? Like even getting these broad constitutional principles of like having a right to a healthful environment. Like, what does that even mean, right? Like just even articulating like, what is a healthful environment and what does the right to that mean? Like, how does that get operationalized on the ground? There's so much work to be done in that area. And I feel like a lot of that happens at Richardson, actually, like the environmental law program and the Native Hawaiian law program are probably, in my opinion, some of the strongest programs in terms of having really amazing professors who are willing to like engage in projects that answer that question directly. Yeah, it's a really difficult task, right? Because we're basically trying to, like I said, operationalize these principles in ways that are fair and just and equitable for everyone. And so what might look like a healthful environment for some might be different for others, right? And so I think it's a really tricky, that's the task of everyone. That's the task of legislators, that's the task of agency personnel, that's a task of judges and law clerks, and I think it's a couple effort on that end, especially under climate change conditions. I feel like that's all hands on deck type of effort. And you see the spectrum, right, of like how science translates into policies and how policies translate into codified statutes, and vice versa. So to the extent that you're interested in that, you have there's like a lot of opportunity there, I think, even in that translation aspect. That's something that I'm personally interested in as well. So yeah, because you don't want to let these like constitutional provisions just stand on paper, right? Like if I have a right to a healthful environment, I want to be able and be empowered to be able to enact that. So yeah. Cool. Go ahead.
Just to add to that, just a story of hope on that front. My dad's a environmental indigenous rights lawyer in Montana for the Salish tribes dealing with their water rights. And he played a pivotal role in getting statewide in-stream flow standards established stemming from the reservation, but propagated statewide. That also included like a $2 billion settlement for the tribes,
Yeah,
so.
it's possible.
That's
Not to, like.
No, I think sharing stories like that is really key, right? Because we see an uphill battle. And it's really not until the successes that we realize like what's possible and like being able to build off of that momentum, I think is really key. So if anyone else also has stories like that, they're cool case studies that personally inspire me. Yeah, Professor Grace.
Yeah, I was just curious, okay, so I think a lot about. We think a lot about on the ground stuff
Mhm.
and, you know, test the soil and monitor the animals,
Right.
you know, do the GIS analysis and all of that. But there seems to be a really big gap between like enforcement and the judiciary, and I'm just wondering, now being on kind of that judiciary end of things, if you've thought about how to improve. I think all three of those components have to work. The DLNR side, and I realize enforcement is within DLNR too, but and then the judiciary. So I don't know, I don't get those.
How do we
systems working
bridge?
that
Yeah,
way.
that's what we're trying to do, guys. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to be interdisciplinary and bridge things. Yeah, I think it's just like an ongoing project. I feel like to the extent that we have more people who are interested in being bridges themselves and like really, and I think that's what I tried to do in my career, like coming from science into policy into law, is to just understand all realms as a way to improve our communication of the connections between them. I personally have seen science and research engaged more at the legislative level as it relates to helping legislators understand why certain laws, especially that as it relates to environment, are really important. Because by the time I feel like you get to the court system, someone has already filed a lawsuit basically alleging that a law was infringed upon, if that makes sense. So it's interesting too, the role that courts play in that process. I am a new law clerk, so I personally haven't like seen, I feel like, enough to really speak to, at least as it relates to environmental law, how the courts kind of influence that. But a large part of our work as clerks and as judges is to understand the intent behind the legislature and understand the intent behind certain statutes that parties are seeking to either enforce or say was infringed upon. So to the extent that, you know, even scientists can inform legislators about what's happening, what's like the latest on climate change or even water issues or whatever it may be, so that when they write their statutes and policies in their, you know, committee reports and in their discussions, there's material there for them to base their decision making on. I think that translates in the judicial system in the sense that when we're trying to understand a party's issues and how to resolve them, we often resort back to the legislative intent of a given law as a way to resolve their problems. So that's like just one way that I can conceptualize that working, like to the extent that legislators are informed about the science backing their environmental policies and are articulating that in the process of passing a bill. Courts often, yeah, like I said, rely on that in their decision making, in deciding one way or another in what might be like a vague situation, like what is a healthful environment, right? If the legislator writes like this is what it means, this is what environmental quality means in this state in particular, courts can use that material to help them make their decisions. That's like one way I see interdisciplinary bridging of these different fields, but I think what I would like to see more is just collaboration and communication among experts of these fields as well, and people being really competent across the spectrum. I think that only increases like our ability to address the issues that we want.
I was wondering, you know, I'm kind of skeptical, and so when I'm reading the law or the statute, then I'm noticing cheat words, like feasible. And to the extent it's feasible, that's a cheat, that's a way to cheat out of it. Right? I mean, in a sense, like cheat and well, you know, and aren't those kind of legal terms?
I mean, I guess it depends, right? It depends like in what context you're
It's like
addressing this law. Yeah, I think, I mean, that's the words of the legislature. So to the
Oh,
extent
so at
that
that point, it needs to be
you should go to the legislative
legislature
history.
to make sure the cheat words are in there.
And well, to understand why they put that proposed language in there, right? Like they
So
could have,
they
they
have,
could
like,
have put a
backed
period
out.
there, but they, for some reason, they thought that it was important to include that language, and they thought it was important for that language to be interpreted by the courts in that way. So that's why, again, I go back to legislative history, because there is much discussion about why they include certain words, why they delete it. I mean, I don't know how much you folks know about the legislative process, but it's like various committees, a lot of meetings, back and forth on language, deleting things, adding things, all that kind of stuff. And they're required to, write up their reports and their findings about why those changes are made. So I'm sure you could look up the genesis of that statute and understand why they included that language. And there will be discussions, there's like transcriptions of these hearings and these meetings that discuss why certain changes are made. So yeah, it's pretty interesting. Yeah. I don't know how we're doing on time. I'll just let you folks ask whatever.
We have a couple more minutes.
Yeah.
And normally our online audience is pretty chatty, but today they don't have any questions in the chat, so. I don't know if there's time, I think, for one more question from our in-person audience.
Yeah.
I don't know how much time we have for this question, but I was wondering if you could speak to the role of like contextual inquiry at the level that you're at with the appellate courts.
Yeah, I don't think I really can. It's a really just such an exciting, interesting, and innovative field of law that I, was personally privileged to have learned from, really what are the sort of originators of this new paradigm. I don't know if it's new, but just this cutting edge paradigm, I would say. Our job at the courts is really to make decisions based on the specific facts presented to us by the parties and the relevant law that we have to work with at a given time. And so I can't really speak to how critical and contextual inquiry plays into that. I think if I had more time to think about that and be really clear about what I wanted to share about that, I could and I would. But as a scholar, I would say that it's such an exciting space to be in, especially as it relates to environmental law and native hawaiian rights, because I feel like a lot of the issues that our friend here, what was your name?
Sam.
Sam had identified in terms of operationalizing on the ground, a lot of, I think, workable and feasible solutions to get there come from the field of critical and contextual inquiry. So I will recommend scholarship by Professor Yamamoto, Professor Kukua Sproat, Professor Susan Serrano, Professor Mario Matsuda, and even a recently admitted Professor ʻūilani Tanigawa Lum. They're all kind of who I see as like crit scholar superheroes and superstars. And you can totally Google them and put critical contextual inquiry next to it and find some of their work and explore from there. Yeah.
All right.